product person that's pushing a certain product on you. The goal with long-term care is not to get the Cadillac policy necessarily. I say it's like get the Honda Accord. Let's cover 80% of your statistical risk for the lowest premium we can so that we're not busting up your financial plan or making it a huge part of your budget in retirement. So it's a
Welcome back to the Retire While You Work podcast. I'm Miles Zuger, a wealth advisor here at Adams Wealth Partners, joined by Carson Odom, another wealth advisor here at Adams Wealth Partners, and David Adams, owner, founder, CEO of Adams Wealth Partners. Today, we're going to be talking about how to plan for medical expenses in retirement for, the majority, I would say, if not all retirees. This is one of the bigger expenses that they have in retirement. Into the hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of, let's say, a 30-year retirement. So it's something that needs to be planned for. Where can this money come from to cover these expenses? And how does Medicare and Medicaid affect all of this? We're going to cover some of that today. So just kind of getting started, guys, throw this to both of you. What is maybe one thing off the top here that somebody can do that's, maybe closing in on retirement and realizing that this is going to be one of the bigger expenses for them? Let's assume maybe they have their mortgage paid for, so this probably is the biggest expense that they have. What is like one planning item that they can do just to get a head start if they're a little bit behind?
Yeah, I'll go. I think that if they're still working and they don't already have a basic like a health savings account, an HSA, that is something to definitely consider depending on if they're self-employed or they have an employer that has a plan that allows for that. We can talk about that in a second. I'll let Carson get into that, the details. The other would be just, I think as you go into retirement, a lot of clients, especially that follow our Retire While You Work philosophy, they're not always waiting till 65 to retire when Medicare kicks in. They're retiring at 55, 61, whatever. And the biggest thing we talk about, one of the biggest things we talk about, often the biggest financial gap, is how do we cover health expenses from age 61 in that example to 65 if when they leave their employer, they don't have portable life insurance. Usually if they do, the premiums go way up. So we have to talk, and now it's $2,000 a month instead of $250 when they work there, or they're going to have to go on the
marketplace.
The marketplace to find a plan, and there's different prices on that, or they're going to have to go and get their own standalone policy. So that's often a source of insecurity for people. Like, how am I going to get, health insurance? Can I get it? How much is that going to cost? And it's really for us, once we figure out what the appropriate method is, it's assigning a budget to that. So like, let's say, okay, we're going to assign $10,000 a year from age 60 to 65 to your budget as unexpected, or more expensive healthcare cost to kind of fill that gap that maybe you were spoiled with at your employer or just didn't even know because it was coming out of your paycheck.
That's good. I think, if you're in the, what are we talking, like medical planning for someone who's 60? Is that our goal?
Yeah. Let's say age 60 and maybe, wanting to retire or 5 years to retirement.
Yeah, definitely. You're at a point where you can still have time to take advantage if you're still working. One, HSA, like David said, if you're eligible for it. Even on Medicare, a couple of important notes to remember that even for people who are on Medicare in 2023, the out-of-pocket medical expenses were over $6,000 per year. So even if you're on Medicare, don't think that you're going to sit here and never have to pay another expense anyway. There's still tons of items that are going to hit your bank account. Even if you're on Medicare, it's not I'm on Medicare, everything's going to be taken care of. So one, I think if you're going into a phase of retirement, make sure that your savings, your cash in the bank are going to be more than enough just to pay for what you might think as your base living expenses. Make sure that number for healthcare is elevated, because we've also seen healthcare costs rise at almost double the inflation rate, the standard inflation rate, across the board. So healthcare costs, they're going to keep going up. They're going to be expensive. Just because you're on Medicare doesn't mean they go away. So really plan for the worst and just make sure that healthcare item, health expense item on your budget that you're planning for in retirement, it's a pretty hefty number, unfortunately.
And I'll say we have goal planning and monitoring, our GPM software that we do for clients at different stages of life. And to Carson's point, if somebody says, hey, you know what, I think I need $100,000 a year to live on if I were to retire tomorrow, we make a separate line item for healthcare expenses, even though they say, oh no, that kind of includes everything. That's a big enough unknown that we pull it out separately. And if it's a married couple, Carson mentioned 5 or 6 grand out of pocket. We'll say $10,000 or $12,000 for a couple that we'll put in there just as a conversation starter. And then I was talking to Carson and Miles before we started this. Like for me, I went to the physical therapist today preventatively to get some more than you want to know, but dry needling and some cupping done on my lower back because I like to be active, play tennis, et cetera, et cetera. Insurance, they don't bill insurance. It was $200. It's very important to me to get that done each month. I use my HSA for that. What happens is between that and a couple other preventative things that I do, I might go through and spend my HSA before the end of the year, which I'm about to run out of. And so then it's just on me. And so that would be, so when I do my budget, we have health insurance through Adams Wealth Partners, but I know this is my deductible. Let's say I have a $5,000 deductible. I know I'm going to pay that. I know I'm going to put a few $1,000s into my HSA to max that out. And then for me, like I'm going to have $2,000 or $3,000 of extra expenses in October, November, and December from some of these visits that are going to come out of pocket. So then I'm able to say, okay, $10,000 or $12,000 for me because maybe I do quite a bit of preventative health. And so that is important, I think, to separate that. It's a big enough item that it needs to have that level of detail and thought put behind it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think when we're doing, David, you mentioned our goal planning and monitoring GPM software. When I'm going through this with clients, it's if somebody wants to retire before they're 65 and eligible for Medicare, it is one of the biggest things that affects the plan because they may see their healthcare costs go from essentially zero if their employer is paying for it all, or maybe a few $100 a month to, I mean, in some cases, $1,000 a month or more than that. And so it's a huge expense, which over the course of retirement, I mean, I guess for that maybe 5 or 10 years, if somebody's trying to retire at 55 or 60, has a huge impact on the plan because it's, a big extra cost that they're not paying for if they did work till 65 and had the health coverage through their employer.
Yep. I would almost say, too, David, somebody like in your situation or Miles, whoever has an HSA, I could almost make the case, don't spend it, keep it, pay out of pocket for your healthcare expenses, and view an HSA as a semi-retirement account because an HSA is one of the triple tax advantage accounts out there. Get a deduction for putting money into it, tax deferred growth, and then it's tax-free whenever you pull it out for qualified medical expenses.
Like today, well, it's $200. I used my HSA because I want it to be tax deductible. I already got the tax deduction for putting in the $3,000 or $4,000. What's the limit for an individual?
Maybe around 4 for an individual.
Yeah, a little shy from 4, I believe.
I put in $4 grand. I got a tax deduction. So me spending the $200 a day, I use it because I'm like, I should use it up. Actually, I don't necessarily need to use that up. If I have the cash flow, I should have just paid that $200 on my debit card and just to save it for later because you're saying because it could grow. That's assuming I'm gonna leave it in there long enough to grow.
That's right. You can invest in HSA, which that's where you get the ultimate power is if you have 20 or 30 years, plus if you're younger that can allow the funds to grow, then you get a $4,000 contribution, for example, it grows to $8,000 one day. You pull it out, use it for medical expenses when you're 70. That's amazing. That's incredible. The power of that account for medical expenses one day, if you can still afford your medical expenses from regular cash flow. Just a thought.
You would have to be able to afford to be able to max out the HSA and pay for them out of pocket.
Exactly right.
But those are the great conversations to have with clients to say, yeah, you put in 4,000 or 8,000 for a family. Mm-hmm. Also, do you want to view this as basically a super efficient Roth IRA type of thing with a tax deduction on the front end and tax-free on the back end? Or do you want to actually use this because if you're putting $8 grand in, you kind of need to use that for medical. That's kind of your budget for medical.
Okay. Because you can invest a HSA in anything you want. I mean, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, ETFs, and Carson, to your point, if you wait until you're 65 and treat it more like an IRA and pay cost out of pocket and just treat that as a savings vehicle, that money down the road in retirement doesn't have to be used for health expenses. Now you're still taxed over 65.
You can just pull it out.
Yeah, you can just pull it out. It is taxed like an IRA, but it's not penalized for not using it for healthcare costs like it is pre-65. So there's some people who strategize around that, treat it more like an IRA, knowing that their plan is just to have it as a retirement bucket, 20, 30 years down the road.
More than likely, you'll probably use it for medical expenses because those are going to happen when you're 65 plus. Plus, you can use it Medicare premiums, long-term care premiums. A lot of clients who have long-term care policies, those premiums each and every year are massive sometimes when you get into those later retirement years.
Yeah, they're
You
like
can do your
$8,000 a year. So you could use it to pay for long-term care. That's right. So you're going to use it because everybody over 65 is going to have one of their big ticket items. It's going to be healthcare.
That's right. That's right.
So that's the HSA, and that's kind of how we kind of fold it into the goal planning and simulation as far as retirement planning and that sort of thing. And then for those, let's talk about for a minute, like for those that are younger, I'm going to say like all of us and act like we're the same age.
Totally.
It's really looking at if you work for a company that has a insurance plan, making sure you get on it, and that makes sense. Sometimes it makes sense depending, like Carson, I don't know if you want to talk about this, like in your situation where we have a plan, but you were able to go out and find one on the open market that suited your family a little bit better. You don't have to get in the weeds of that, but what was your thought process there for somebody that maybe works at Nissan and the plan's good, but they're like, actually, I can go to Farm Bureau or somewhere and get one better?
Yeah, I think that's the pickle that people will find themselves in is if they're in a small business that offers health insurance. I feel like that's one of the you can't get a lot of value around there. It's usually so expensive for the employer, and if they don't cover it, it ends up coming to the employee. So for us, you cover the employee, but then I would have to cover additional family members, and each family member is a separate premium. So it's pretty expensive. So for me, it was going to end up being like well over $1,000 a month just for my family's health insurance. I went to Farm Bureau. You have to go through underwriting, and there were some asterisks next to pre-existing conditions, but we were okay. Got health insurance, and now it's like $400 a month. Now, is it the best? It's kind of a high out-of-pocket max. But if you're pretty lean, you're just trying to save yourself from, the big emergencies or whatever, it's kind of the way to go, just to minimize your monthly spend when it comes to health insurance.
Sounds like your boss needs to get a better plan.
Heck yeah, come on, waiting on you.
But that's
yeah.
That's like looking at the insurance plans and then seeing, like with our plan, you can also attach a HSA on top of it. So I went out, and you may be able to go out and get your own HSA to kind of, for some tax advantages. And then we talked about that earlier, like how to look at that. What else for people pre-retirement, like in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, do they need to be looking at? That's really the big things, right?
I think those are the big things. I think it's just also looking at, for the long run, estimated healthcare costs, because to Carson's point, they're rising at about twice as fast as what other inflation levels are. So, you just think over the past few years how much other expenses have increased for lifestyle things. I mean, healthcare is also increasing. It's maybe just not something you're spending money on every week, and so you're not maybe seeing it. But I know when we're running our plans and we're looking at 20 and 30-year projections, those numbers, a small number gets pretty big over those 20 years. Even if you're just looking at 5 or 10,000 of insurance costs, you can see that inflated at 4, 5, 6%. What that does to a plan 25, 30 years down the road.
Yeah. And then like long-term care. I mean, I would say that's part of healthcare. I mean, that obviously applies to, older nursing home, that sort of thing. Not always, but this stereotypical somebody's in their 70s or 80s and they're having some issues with dementia, or they're just needing some assistance at home with 2 of the 6 daily activities of living. That's when somebody, needs a nursing home, and that can be $60,000, $80,000, $100,000 around Middle Tennessee, for example. My mom went through this. She was in one for a few years before she passed. We had a long-term care policy that I probably got my parents maybe 10, 15 years ago. They paid $3,000, $4,000 a year for it, and then ended up it probably paid $150,000 or so before she passed. So it was a good, I guess, investment, if you will. So we have conversations with clients. There's not a perfect time. I mean, an insurance salesperson may start pushing this when somebody's in their 40s and 50s. We usually say 55, 60, if you're healthy and you've had parents, like if this is a concern of yours, you've had parents that have been through this, usually it's going to be more of an emotional weight and a conversation that's coming up proactively. If it's not something you dealt with, you're not too worried about it, we're going to, as good wealth managers, we're going to mention it, explain that, hey, there's a tail side risk of in your retirement plan that at 80, one of you gets dementia for 4 years and it costs $400,000 or $500,000. they can look at that and say, that happens. What else is the money for? I'm not going to be doing anything else with it. Or we've got $5 million. We'll just self-insure. And that's okay. What's not okay is to not have the conversation. But a lot of times when people are in that, I'm getting into the weeds, but if somebody's in that $500,000 to $2 million, in my opinion, of net worth, this is where it could be tricky, where if somebody needs a nursing home, it could spend down most of the retirement assets for the other surviving spouse. And Medicaid, Medicare, none of that picks up the expense until you're out of almost all money. You can have like a little bit of money in a car. So that's where it's tricky. And that's where we recommend trying to get it if you can and having that conversation. Once you have 3, 4, 5, $10 million, you could argue self-insurance. And if you don't have much money at all, you probably and can't afford the premiums, and you're just going to kind of plan on Medicare, TennCare, Medicaid, whatever, helping you at that point once you've spent down your assets. So the key is not, certainly on this podcast, not to know which one is best, but to have that conversation with us or your wealth advisors to say, hey, what does this look like for me? What have you all seen from your experience? And make sure that you're not necessarily talking to an insurance product person that's pushing a certain product on you. The goal with long-term care is not to get the Cadillac policy necessarily. I say it's like, get the Honda Accord. Let's cover 80% of your statistical risk for the lowest premium we can, so that we're not busting up your financial plan or making it a huge part of your budget in retirement. So it's an art, not a science, but that's something that we could do a whole segment on. Anything?
Yeah. I mean, without a doubt,
insurance really is, you don't want to. It's one of the best investments you could ever make if you end up needing it. But it's also, you could view it as a waste of money if you don't end up needing it. So like you said, buy the middle of the road, make sure it's enough insurance, but it's also not something that you're sucking every single penny of your assets into. So
it's like any other insurance. You have car insurance, you have home insurance. You obviously hope you don't ever have to use those. I mean, most people probably have life insurance also that you obviously hope you never have to use, but you're glad you had it in the event that it's covering that risk that you're insuring against.
And the difference with long-term care versus like house insurance, there is a, I don't know, less than 1% chance that your house is going to burn down, knock on wood. It does happen. And it's really expensive if it does. And that premium's, X amount of dollars, maybe $1,000 a year, for example. There's like a 45% chance ish statistically. If you have a spouse, you're married, have a partner, that one of you will need care for at least a year. So if care is $80,000 in my example, and there's almost a 50% chance you'll need it. Well, even if you pay $5,000, $6,000 a year for 10 or 15 years, the break even is pretty low in that scenario. So just something to think about. Always look at what is the cost and then what is the break even. And we have those conversations with clients. And then, maybe, I don't know, a client asked me this the other day, like, what percentage of your clients in our situation have long-term care? It's like probably less than half, probably 30, 40%, decent amount. Some don't want to talk about it, or it just hasn't come up yet, or they just say no. Others, it comes up and they're self-insured and they've assumed the risk and they understand it. And probably of the people that we had that conversation with that don't just say no immediately, half of them get the insurance and half of them just self-insure. And sometimes what happens is they apply for the insurance, but they have some pretty bad pre-existing conditions that the insurance companies will jack the prices way up. And so we look at together, it's like, well, it's not worth $20,000 a year. We were hoping $8,000. Let's just self-insure. So that's kind of the rhythm of the conversation there. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah. And I think I would add those who we work with who have had a family member who have went through it, and in both scenarios, either had a long-term care policy or didn't have one, and saw how much that was, maybe spent down retirement funds or other investment savings, see the power in having a long-term care policy to cover these expenses, because they know just how much of a weight the policy either took off their family situation, or how much of a weight that put on their family situation by not having something to carry those costs.
That's right. The main thing is, I think, to have these conversations like we're having here, tailored to you. Take a look at what you have through your employer. If you're self-employed, especially if you don't have any insurance, make sure you go to the exchange or whatever, at least have something, and that you fill the gaps, and you don't make it a huge surprise when all of a sudden you get an out-of-pocket bill for $4,000 because your deductible was $4,000 and you had a $10,000 knee replacement or whatever, $30,000, whatever it is. You don't want to have sticker shock, and you want to have that in your emergency fund. So when we do bucket one of our plan, an emergency fund, we talk about 3 to 6 to 12 months expenses. Part of that we're factoring in is, unexpected healthcare cost, plus all the other things that emergency funds for, in case you lose your job, in case you need a new AC unit, new car, get laid off, all those things. That's what a bucket one emergency fund is for. But part of that needs to be factoring in that $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 a year we need to have ready to go for healthcare.
And another thing to think about is we only know what we know, and that's the healthcare as it's in its form today. 30 years from now, I have no idea. We have no idea what healthcare is going to look like. We might have completely free healthcare provided by the government. Who knows? We can only do so much planning. It's kind of like taxes. Whenever you get into tax planning, who knows where rates are going to go? I have a feeling that rates are probably going to go up and not down from here. But at the same time, you can't make assumptions, 20, 30 years from now, when all we know is what tax rates are today. Same thing in the medical world. We know what the healthcare system is in today's world. We know what the long-term care situation is in today's world. We can plan off of that. And if something changes, we'll adapt.
That's right.
I would add too, when just as a final thing, when planning for Medicare and signing up, I think it's important to work with somebody who's knowledgeable and works in that every day, because that's something you want to get right on the front end and make sure that you have all the proper coverages that line up with maybe doctors you're already seeing and in network with that, because a lot of changes start to come if you're signed up for the wrong policy, or you can find some issues maybe later on. So it's working with somebody who's knowledgeable and can keep you with your same doctors, so that when you do start Medicare at 65, you don't have to start looking for other people that you're not comfortable with.
That's right.
Reach out to us and we can provide you a name. Happy to help.
Good stuff, boys.
Thanks for joining us today. And we look forward to continuing to do these and planning to help those retire while they work.
Yeah, thanks for listening. We'll talk to you soon.
See you next time.
Any opinions are those of myself and not necessarily those of Raymond James. Expressions of opinion are as of this date and are subject to change without notice. The information contained in these podcasts do not purport to be a complete description of the securities market or developments referred to in this material. The information has been obtained from sources considered to be reliable, but we do not guarantee that the foregoing material is accurate or complete. Every investor situation is unique, and you should consider your investment goals, risk tolerance, and time horizon before making any investment. Prior to making an investment decision, please consult with your financial advisor about your individual situation. Any hypothetical examples are for illustration purposes only. Actual investor results will vary. Raymond James does not provide legal or tax services. Please discuss these matters with the appropriate professional.